Okay, I think most of us here know Dan Viets, but I have a lovely bio about him. He's going to be speaking on today 6 months of legal marijuana in Missouri. Yay. Dan is an attorney in private practice in Columbia, concentrating on the defense of marijuana cases. So he may have less of those in the future. He has served for many years as a Missouri state coordinator for NORML. He's former president of the Missouri Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, former chair of the board of Missouri ACLU, former president of the University of Missouri Student Body, and former chair of the City of Columbia Human Rights Commission. Dan is a very busy guy. He's the recipient of a number of awards. One of them was Martin Luther King Association's Keeping the Dream Alive Award in 1993. He got an interesting signing one called High Times Freedom Fighter of the Month in March 2005. He also, of course, played a major role in passing both the Marijuana Decriminalization Initiative and medical marijuana formerly in November of 2004. He received, this is very interesting, he wanted me to include this, the Audiency Award from Conan O'Brien on The Tonight Show for looking most like a college professor who could always get you weed. So that was pretty interesting. Dan also hosts, and probably a number of us listen to, Sex, Drugs, and Civil Liberties on National Public Radio and on KOPN. I forget which night now, Dan, but Tuesday nights, right?
Right.
Right. He co-authored, very importantly, Missouri's medical marijuana law and chaired the board of the 2018 campaign. He co-authored Missouri's law legalizing adult use, which is what we'll hear about today. So with that, he's also currently, are you president of NORML or secretary of NORML right now? But he's also a lifetime member of NORML's legal committee. Thanks for being here today, Dan. We're really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Sarah, also for your work at KOPN especially. And thanks for the chance to talk about this topic. I obviously enjoy talking about this. It was 50 years ago that I was president of the student body at MU. At that time, there was a unified student body. The professional, graduate, and undergraduates were all part of the Missouri Students Association. One of the perks that I got was a junket to Washington, D.C. in the summer of, must have been 72, and attended the National Student Association's conference, which was a radical group in those days. But it also happened to coincide with the very first National NORML Conference, the People's Pot Conference, with tongue-in-cheek, held at a church in downtown Washington. And so I made a side trip over there and met the founder of NORML, and have been involved with the group at some level ever since then. Back in those days, we had support from approximately 12% of the American population, the voters, for legalization of marijuana. And obviously, the support has grown substantially since then. And partly as a result of the aging of the population, the baby boom bulge in the population, and continues at this time. Support for legalization continues to increase, and largely as a result of the fact that at this point, 38, if I've got the count correct, 38 states have done what Missouri did in 2018, and that is to legalize access to marijuana as medicine. I did have the honor to co-author that measure and chaired the board of directors of that campaign. And you may recall there was an historic anomaly. We had 3 separate medical marijuana measures on the ballot in 2018. No other state has faced that situation, but we had a group that was somehow concerned about a constitutional amendment, and so they had proposed essentially our proposal, but as a statutory amendment. Well, the legislature is going to repeal that just as soon as they convene. If we had passed that as a statutory measure, that's why people who want to change the law in Missouri have to resort to a constitutional amendment. And of course, we're seeing a very heated debate right now about the initiative process. The fact that the Missouri Supreme Court just ruled yesterday that the Attorney General does not have the option to prevent an initiative from moving forward. We were very concerned that we might run into similar problems with our two initiatives. Our second initiative, of course, was in 2022, but the 2018 measure again faced two others. The third one was the type of campaign that we ought to be concerned about, in my opinion. A single individual, a single wealthy attorney who also has an MD degree, Brad Bradshaw, who supports the billboard industry almost single-handedly. Mr. Bradshaw placed his own initiative on the ballot, which would have required that somebody who is both a lawyer and a doctor had to be appointed to head the program, and that it would have massive amounts of tax revenue. And he promised he would cure cancer if we would just, pass his measure. And he outspent us, especially in the last month of the campaign. But I'll tell you, I think back on that campaign when I am tempted to question the wisdom of the voters, and we all are, of course, quite often. But in fact, the voters sorted that out. They saw that there were three measures on the same issue on the ballot. What we thought a lot of voters would do is just vote for all three and hope that at least one of them passes. That would seem like a rational approach for an uninformed voter. But in fact, the voters were much smarter than that. And they knew exactly what they were doing. And despite Bradshaw outspending us, his measure dropped some 20 points in the last month of that campaign. He wound up with 30-some percent support. The other measure, the harmless but naive one, got a little over 40, but our measure passed with just a fraction shy of 66%, more than any statewide candidate, more than any of the several other measures, including the clean amendment that were on that ballot. So we were happy. Of course, we were happy we didn't have to litigate after that campaign was over. Our Constitution actually contemplates that situation. The Missouri Constitution says that if there are multiple initiatives on a ballot on the same topic, that the one with the most votes prevails. But we expected we'd have to litigate if either of the other two got more than 50%. They did not. We had a little more respect in the General Assembly, a little more respect in the General Assembly after that victory. And we knew from polling that a majority of Missourians would support a reasonably moderate adult use legalization measure. We eschew the term recreational because it seems to kind of trivialize the issue. And the issue really is not about getting high. The issue is about stopping the criminalization of a large portion of our population, people who are good, responsible citizens who do not deserve to be treated like criminals. And so we refer to what we passed in 2022 as adult use, non-medical use. And I do want to review with you. I'm going to try to run through it quickly, but I want to review with you some of the features of what was passed by the voters in 2022. So if I can manage to screen share, let's see, can you all see now what?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. I can't myself. I can't seem to move this thing over. Can you help me? I failed to follow your advice, and this thing is stuck over here now. Maybe there, I can get it out of the way. Never mind. Thank you. So what we did, this PowerPoint was prepared in anticipation of the election. But of course, the fundamental change is we've legalized use, possession, buying, consuming, and cultivating. Cultivating, very important, not something that helps the industry, but the industry, which did support this campaign financially, made many compromises, accepted many things in here, which in fact diminish their likelihood of making money, and legalizing personal cultivation is one of them. Likewise, there is no cap, despite we heard from a lot of people who frankly lied about this. I'm sorry to say, a couple of judges who I otherwise like and admire lied about this in an op-ed piece in the St. Louis Post. There is no cap on the number of business licenses that may be issued. We don't mandate that everybody gets a license, but there is no cap. And the legislature can increase that. The governor can increase that. The DHSS head can increase that number anytime. Other states which have legalized have seen actually a dramatic reduction in use by teenagers. And there's some other stats on that point, and we allow every adult to grow as many as 18 plants. So it's a very permissive measure compared to most other states. One thing that's new is it allows dispensaries now to sell seeds and seedlings and clones, making it much easier for people to grow their own cannabis. It legalizes gifting to another adult as much as 3 ounces at a time. There's no limit on the number of times you can give 3 ounces to another adult. One of the most important parts of it is expungement. I do want to dwell on this for a moment. It is one of the equity measures in Article 14. We have at this point expunged at least 50,000. I tried to get an updated number yesterday. It hasn't come through yet, but we've succeeded in expunging at least 50,000 marijuana cases from all over the state of Missouri. And that's great, but on the other hand, very few counties have, well, no county, I think, has actually been able to meet the deadline of expunging all misdemeanors by the 8th of June. Some counties are making a good faith effort. Some are not. Those who are not may be the subject of some litigation. We may seek a writ of mandamus from the Supreme Court, and then if they fail to continue, if they continue to fail to make good faith efforts, they will be in contempt of court. That seems to be the most logical way to enforce that provision. But it is a very important part of this measure, and the fact that it's automatic is important. Now, there are groups across the nation working on automatic expungement now. I was privileged to work on a Missouri Bar Committee that drafted our current expungement laws in Missouri. And they're certainly better than none, but only a fraction of a percent of the people eligible for expungement under Missouri law have actually gone to court and gotten their expungements, because it's expensive, it's cumbersome, it's time consuming. Most lawyers have no idea how to litigate these expungements. Automatic expungement is far more helpful. Automatic expungement, as the name suggests, requires no effort by the person who was prosecuted. Now, I'm avoiding using a term conviction because our measure, by its plain wording, applies to people whose cases did not result in a conviction, technically. And many first offense, small amount possession cases result in what's called a suspended imposition of the sentence, which is technically not a conviction. Some counties now, Phelps is among them, are pretending that they can't expunge an SIS because it's not a conviction. And that's ridiculous. We've been expunging SIS disposition on DWI cases now for decades. And I am confident that issue will be resolved in favor of expungement in the near future. There are some other issues which shouldn't be issues. Some municipal courts are pretending that they're not part of the circuit courts. And since our law only says that circuit courts shall expunge, that they are somehow exempt, they are not. They are a division of the circuit courts. And there's just no doubt about that. There are some other issues that need to be resolved, but for the most part, expungement is going very well. One of the other, well, I argue the single most important equity measure is the simple fact that we don't arrest people for marijuana use and possession any longer. The ACLU did a landmark study about 10 years ago called Marijuana in Black and White, and it brought out the fact of the shocking disparity in the arrest rates between Black and white Americans. The fact that, according to all the data we have, that Blacks and whites use marijuana at roughly the same rate, the same percentage. And yet, in Missouri, for instance, 2.6 times more African Americans have been arrested for marijuana. And stopping that is the single most important equity measure we could possibly pass. That means that, and ACLU likewise, the report says that Missouri has arrested 20,000 of our fellow citizens each year for the past few decades at least. So 20,000, Black folks are roughly 10%. It's a little more, but roughly 10% of the population. 10% of 20,000, of course, is 2,000. That's how many Black people should have been arrested if the numbers were fair. In fact, it's roughly 5,000, 25% of that number that were African Americans. And so the greatest equity measure is to stop those arrests and prosecutions and to undo, to the extent that we can, to undo the damage that marijuana prohibition has done. But marijuana prohibition's been around a long time, a century, and possibly a little longer. Missouri passed one of the first anti-marijuana laws in the nation in 1917, and it outlawed hashish dens. Now, our legislature is always on the lookout for any threat to the morality of our citizens. I don't know that there were any hashish dens, but they were taking a preemptive measure there. And so you could still have hashish, you could still have dens, but you couldn't have hashish in your den after that law was passed in 1917. So we're talking about, again, over a century of marijuana laws. And I don't, I don't doubt that it's going to be a daunting task to expunge all of those. On the other hand, we provide the funding for it. There's a 6% tax on marijuana sales. According to a recent report from the industry, $3.5 million a day of marijuana is being sold legally in Missouri. That's a lot of tax revenue. And that money is available to support the additional staff that should be hired in order to get these expungements done. But that's one of the most important things that's occurred during the first 6 months. As the PowerPoint says, we increase state revenue after expungement is paid for. This tax for the indefinite future will be divided 3 ways. The 6% statewide sales tax will fund drug addiction treatment with specific criteria for real addiction treatment that's been shown to be scientifically effective. It'll help to pay for veteran services, as indeed the 4% tax on medical does, but there'll be fewer medical patients once adult use is legal. That's happened in 20 some other states. And so that was predictable. We wanted to make sure veteran services didn't lose money. So we added them into this law as well. And we're most proud of helping to fund the public defender system. Not a popular thing to do. It didn't gain us many votes, but it's a good thing to do. That 6% sales tax was predicted to by our state auditor. As we know, the Attorney General didn't choose to try to overrule his estimate, and he estimated at least 40 million a year. In fact, it's probably a great deal more. Now, and as well, in April, that both Boone County and Columbia, and indeed over 100 jurisdictions across the state, exercised the option that we invited them to do in drafting Article 14. They passed an additional 3% local sales tax. But the question of whether those taxes can be stacked on top of each other is still unresolved. I expect it'll be litigated. I expect the litigation will result in saying no, that the county can collect taxes outside the city limits, that the cities can collect 3% within their city limits, but we're not going to, I don't think we're going to have an additional 6% tax. One important equity measure in the 2022 Section 2 of Article 14 is mandating at least, again, I emphasize at least 144 new business licenses. I don't like the term micro, but that's the term we use. They are in fact substantial and potentially very profitable licenses. The application period, if you'd like to get into the industry, the application period begins next Thursday, the 27th of July. DHSS will begin accepting applications from people who want to obtain a license to either have a wholesale or retail operation. There'll be in each congressional district in this round of licensing, there will be 4 wholesale licenses, which allow you to grow and manufacture products, edibles, and concentrates. And there'll be only 2 retail licenses in each congressional district. There's a $1,500 application fee, but that will be refunded in a few months if your application is not successful. And there's no more of the scoring business. The scoring was intended to be a good thing, but it wound up with people just being aggravated, and it was arbitrary, and different people gave different scores to identical answers. We're doing away with that. All licenses will be issued through a lottery from this point forward. And again, there's no limit. Next year, there'll be 2 more rounds of so-called micro licenses issued. That'll total 144. I hope they keep on going. I hope they issue more and more regular licenses as well, full licenses. I think competition is in the best interest of consumers. But I think the people who wanted to mandate that everybody in Missouri could grow and sell marijuana were just naive, politically unrealistic. Let's see what else. We also made some tweaks to the medical law in 2022. We went back and rewrote some provisions of the 2018 medical law, making medical cards good for 3 years instead of just 1, and reducing the cost for those with one thing. We also cut the fee to cultivate. You have to get a special license from DHSS to cultivate cannabis, but we cut that fee in half for medical patients from $100 to $50. One thing that I argued for and did end up in the final draft is employment discrimination protection for medical patients for off-the-job use. Patients should not be subject to either being denied a job or being disciplined or being fired because of their off-the-job medical use. But I hear from a lot of patients lately who say they are still being subjected to discrimination. Unfortunately, we did not provide for attorney fees. And it's not cheap to hire a lawyer to suit Walmart. I have a meeting later this afternoon with a bunch of criminal defense lawyers, and I hope we may get some ideas there about how to make that measure more effective, but it is a constitutional right. We also outlawed the use of no-knock search warrants, which are extremely dangerous, both for police and for their victims, as we know from the Breonna Taylor case down in Louisville. It is now stated in our Constitution that the odor of marijuana is no longer probable cause for a search. And that's, I don't think there's going to be any way for the police to get around that. Many of the searches that take place, especially of African Americans after traffic stop, are based on the odor of cannabis. Well, those searches are no longer legal. We also have included, I frankly advocated for these measures, that people on bond awaiting trial can no longer have their bond revoked because they use marijuana legally, nor can people on probation or parole have their status as probationers and parolees threatened because of legal marijuana use. Now, judges and prosecutors certainly, and many judges are they're just digging in their heels, and they just don't want to accept that. But I believe they're going to have to accept that. It's not as easy as it ought to be to get our judges to obey the Constitution that they've sworn to uphold. Every lawyer swears an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution and the Missouri Constitution when we are enrolled, and every year when we pay our bar dues. And I remind judges of that, and they say, yeah, but I don't know. It's an interesting debate, but one I predict we will prevail in. And many people who are serving time in jail or prison can petition for release. Not all of them, unfortunately. The polling showed that letting out people who had 200 pounds was not popular, but people who are in prison for 3 pounds or less, and there are several of them, many of them, they are eligible for immediate release. And communities can opt out of marijuana sales, but it has to be by a vote of the people, not the city council, not the county commission, not any politician, but a vote of the population. And historically, and especially in California, those elections generally result in people saying, we do want that tax money. No, we don't want to prohibit marijuana sales in our community. Many states have had a so-called per se DWI law, where if you test positive, you're convicted. We will not have that in Missouri. I'm losing my cursor here. That is essentially, boy, I can't seem to there we go. But again, the most important thing, and we've doubled the number of patients for whom a caregiver can work. A private individual can cultivate cannabis in larger numbers for under the old law for up to 3 patients. Under the new law, the 2022 measure, up to a half dozen patients, and they can be paid for their time and their work and their overhead and their expenses for doing so. But again, the most important thing is it stops most of, and we think the great majority of 20,000 arrests each year. And should they choose to do it, allows the police to focus on violent and property crime. Now, the fact is that, and I've seen not a single instance of media coverage of this fact, but it may be partly my fault. I certainly get my share of media, but the press does not seem interested in pointing out that 20,000 fewer arrests each year should mean less work for the police. I mean, 20,000 fewer arrests. That either means they can do other things, or maybe they don't need quite as high a budget. But not a single police department has suggested that their budget be reduced because they no longer arrest people for marijuana. Not a single court has suggested that because I don't have all those marijuana cases on my docket any longer, that my court's budget can be reduced. Not a single prosecutor has said, oh boy, now that I don't have to prosecute all those marijuana cases, I can get by with less money. No, not a single one, nor has the probation office. And the probation office is probably the worst on this. They keep insisting that all the probation officers in the state shall file probation violation reports on people who test positive for marijuana, even though it's clearly prohibited that their probation be revoked under the Missouri Constitution. You know, and the Constitution creates our court system. The Constitution creates our legislature. It creates our executive branch, of course. There is no authority for the courts or for the probation office other than the authority in the Missouri Constitution. And yet that same document, when it orders our courts and our probation offices not to revoke people's probation, they are just desperate to find some way to evade following the law. They don't like it when my clients do that, but they are doing exactly what many defendants are accused of. That's breaking the law and finding ways to rationalize violating the law. But we do have, some people say, well, I guess you'll be disbanding NORML now. We've got marijuana legal, so there's nothing for NORML to do anymore. Well, in fact, there is. Marijuana, just as, you know, Roe versus Wade didn't do away with the need for Planned Parenthood, as we know now, even more than ever. And there are many issues, as I've already remarked, which are unresolved. And will need to be litigated, will need to be resolved in some cases through the legislature. We had an agenda this year, a legislative agenda, which was extensive. I want to give thanks and recognition to Adrian Plank in particular for being willing to file some bills that we knew and he knew, you know, being Democrat bills probably weren't going to get very far this year. But it's important, I believe, to have those bills filed. And here are some of the bills that Adrian filed for us, and we had some other sponsors as well, but extending job discrimination protection to non-medical marijuana users. You know, that's not as radical as it sounds. It turns out that there is a law on the books in the state of Missouri which specifically prohibits job discrimination for people who use alcohol or people who use tobacco. As long as it's used off the job, no employer in the state of Missouri can deny a job, discipline, or terminate an employee because of off-the-job alcohol or tobacco use. If they just add cannabis to that list, we'd be much happier. And that's exactly what Adrian's bill proposed to do. Another bill that Adrian filed would have mandated expansion of business licensing. You know, the Republicans are supposed to be the free marketeers. They're supposed to be the capitalists. They're supposed to be the ones that value competition and the free marketplace. But the irony is it's been Democrats who have been advocating in Jefferson City for the free market in the cannabis industry. And it's been largely Republicans who have resisted opening up the business to more people, opening up to more competition. But nonetheless, I think that eventually that'll happen. The House has voted 3 times already in just the past 4 years to lift the limits that DHS has imposed on the number of medical licenses that can be issued. And so the House having done so 3 times, if we can get a few more senators on board, that's a bill that may pass. We filed a bill, that is Adrian filed a bill for us to require state universities and colleges to allow medical use of marijuana on those campuses. You know, there's no campus that prohibits the use of oxycodone, for instance, or other very dangerous and addictive and potentially deadly pharmaceutical drugs. None of them are restricted, but for some reason, these same institutions seem to think that their campus will crumble into chaos if marijuana were allowed on the campus. So, you know, our proposal is edibles, and you know, we're trying to make it as easy for the campuses to accept that as possible. It's something that could be litigated in the future, but I hope the legislature will settle that for us. Adrian, Bill 785, which would provide job protection for non-medical users, also provided, as New York State has decided, to allow medical, or rather to allow marijuana use in any location where tobacco use is allowed. So, you know, in New York, that is the state of the law statewide. Adrian's bill would have also expanded the release of marijuana prisoners to include those guys that had 200 pounds going down the interstate, and people who are in prison for larger amounts of marijuana. One bill we opposed, in fact, I think the only negative bill in the legislature this session on marijuana was the so-called open container bill. And we testified against that. Steve Faber, who's been active with NORML here in mid-Missouri, retired attorney, testified against that bill. And indeed, it was defeated. It's generally easier, fortunately, I think it's easier to stop a bill than it is to pass one. You know, we have a couple thousand bills filed every session, and we have maybe, you know, a few dozen that actually pass each year. And I'll tell you, back when I started working on this issue, going down to Jeff City in the late 70s, testifying against horrible bills, I was so glad that most of those bills don't pass, because it was a competition back then among politicians to see who could come up with some new way to twist the knife in the back of marijuana smokers. You know, they took away their jobs, they took away their children, they took away their driver's licenses. They did everything they could come up with to make it harder on people who used marijuana. Now that has changed 180 degrees. Now we have a list of, with few exceptions, of very positive bills. And now I wish it was easier to pass bills, at least in this context. So some other bills that were proposed this year, and in fact did pass, are a bill to allow, or at least to make it easier for banks to provide banking services to the marijuana industry. And we supported that. There's no reason to require marijuana businesses to operate in cash, and it creates a magnet for crime. If people know there's large amounts of cash sitting in every marijuana dispensary, the temptation to try to rob those places increases. I'm not aware of any such robberies in Missouri. I'm surprised, frankly, we don't see more of them, but it's still a good idea to allow those businesses to use banking services. And the legislature passed a bill which will help, doesn't solve the problem. It's going to take an act of Congress to solve the problem. There was also a bill requiring background checks for industry employees. And that wasn't because they were really worried about the employees, but again, it makes it easier to secure banking services because of some federal regulations. There was a bill filed to say that the odor of marijuana is no longer probable cause for a search. Well, we appreciated that bill, but it's already in the Constitution, so we really didn't need that one. A bill was filed which would allow marijuana businesses to deduct their operating expenses from their state income tax. The federal government does not allow marijuana businesses to deduct their cost of operations. And that makes it extremely difficult to make any money in the marijuana business because you're being taxed on your gross income. And it, the tax burden on marijuana businesses is tremendous. So, I mean, it's not as easy. It's not the big cash cow that it would seem like it ought to be. Another bill was filed to provide protection for medical marijuana patients in family court, primarily in child custody and visitation disputes. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware how angry, mean, and vindictive some people become in divorce proceedings, and especially in child custody issues. We don't think that marijuana use should be a factor that the courts should take into account unless, as with alcohol, there's evidence that it is so extreme or constant that it actually endangers the children in some way or another. But that also is also already in the Constitution. Nick Schroer, who is an interesting guy, filed a bill to make it a crime to disclose who is on the list of legal medical marijuana patients. He thinks the federal government is somehow out to get that information and use it against us. Nick's good on some things, at least. And marijuana facility background checks, again, was something that the industry actually wanted to have passed. And they got 2 or 3 of those bills passed this session. I think this is probably, let me check my notes, but this is probably a good point to stop and let me see if I can open up the chat. Maybe there's some questions I should respond to there.
Yes, there are.
I don't know why.
Few.
It's interesting to speculate why teenage use has dropped in states that have legalized, but that's been shown in at least a half dozen different studies. So speculation is the forbidden fruit aspect. It may be part of it, that it, when it was illegal for everybody, then it had a special attraction for some young people at least. But I don't think anyone knows. I think all we can do is speculate about that. Isn't taxing different on medical cards? It is a 4% sales tax on medical sales of marijuana, but a 6% and now 9% in most places, potentially 12. So yes, it's a considerably higher sales tax, and that's another reason to retain a medical card, because, and not only that, but there are some dispensaries that give preference to medical patients that allow them to go to the head of the line, literally, if there's a line at the dispensary. So there are some advantages and some good reasons to keep that medical card in effect. The amount of sales, yeah, it's unbelievable, but on average, the figure is 3.5 million per day. We are approaching $1 billion with a B, as Carl Sagan says, dollars in marijuana sales per year now. And so the sales tax revenue will, of course, increase proportionately to that. And keep in mind, this is not, for the most part, the great majority of this is people that otherwise would have purchased that marijuana from drug dealers. And I like drug dealers. Some of them are my clients and friends, but they don't pay taxes. Marijuana prohibition was a great deal for drug dealers because not only were the prices artificially inflated because it was an illegal commodity, not only was there very little real competition, most people didn't know more than 1 or 2 people that might have marijuana for sale, but they did not pay a penny in taxes on that revenue. And so now that money is going into the legal market. It's hard times for pot dealers, but the people that used to buy from illegal dealers, for the most part, are now going to stores where they have, not only do they have the luxury of a choice. Most pot dealers had one kind of pot. You have pot, yes or no, that's it. But in the dispensaries, you have dozens of varieties, and you can actually make an informed choice. And here's the most important thing: I heard from so many prohibitionists who would wring their hands and clutch their pearls about, oh, this marijuana may be contaminated with something, and who knows what's in that marijuana. Well, if they really care, they should support legalization. because all of the marijuana that is sold in these dispensaries is tested by law. It is tested for potency. It is tested for purity. So the consumer has the ability to know the potency of what he or she is acquiring, and to know that it's not contaminated with fentanyl or any other free drugs, which I think is largely a myth. Not many drug dealers give away free drugs, but not only that it's not contaminated with other drugs, but it's not contaminated with mold, which is a real threat, and a real problem for people with asthma and other similar ailments. And so legalization has brought a tremendous benefit to consumers in several respects. And that's what NORML is about, is advocating for the interests of consumers. Does the DOR collect the 6%? Yep. Is there any oversight? Well, there is, in the sense that of course, those records are open to the public, and the press fixates on the money. The press covers the easy stories for the most part. And that's, oh, here's a dispensary. I can take a picture of it. I can take my video down there and show the dispensary and show the marijuana. And what's harder to quantify is the reduction in arrests. And to me, that's the real story. That's the most important thing, that not only are we saving the state millions and millions of dollars by not arresting 20,000 people a year, but we're saving those people from having their lives disrupted and having to pay lawyers like me to go to court with them and represent them. And, I'm not entirely facetious. I mean, I sometimes think that I've done a foolish thing here. My income is suffering because marijuana prohibition has been repealed. I'm having to reconsider taking some cases I wouldn't have taken before. Marie, did you have a question? I see your virtual hand is up.
Yes, my questions have to do with, and they're related, I guess, have to do with sort of the equity issues. One, and probably the more simple one, is about the zip codes that were selected for the micro licenses. And I've read that, for example, Clayton was one of the zip codes.
Columbia.
Yeah. Which doesn't bear relation to the low income people that was supposed to serve. But then my other question has to do with what you were just talking about the 20,000 arrests. When I read about someone being arrested in the newspaper for a single incident, usually there's a litany of 6 or 8 things that they're charged with. And I wondered to what extent the marijuana arrests were done in conjunction with all these other charges. And will they still be able to pick people up for no good reason and charge them with 6 different infractions or whatever? Aside from the marijuana charge.
I think the cases that make the papers are the ones where somebody's charged with murder or robbery or some horrible crime and marijuana possession. Those are a small part of the marijuana arrests. The vast majority of the people I've represented for 37 years are MU students who are out in their car or out in a parking garage smoking, and the police know to cruise those garages and watch for those students. The vast majority of them are people who are arrested only for marijuana and paraphernalia or something of that nature. By the way, paraphernalia is legal now, and paraphernalia convictions and cases are being expunged along with the marijuana cases. But I think it's just that the more sensational cases are the ones that tend to make the papers. So I think they represent, I'm reasonably certain they represent a tiny percentage of the total number of arrests. As far as equity, yes, there were some strange results. We know from the recent Supreme Court case on Harvard and North Carolina that they're not allowing race to be a factor in college admissions. Several federal courts have already overturned states that had attempted to put essentially affirmative action into their marijuana licensing proposals. And we knew that if we did that, it would be overturned. So we tried to do it indirectly. We said that people with relatively little property or relatively low incomes And so by a relatively little property, it's like less than $250,000. You don't have to be destitute. Relatively low income is, I think, 2.5 times the poverty level. So you can make 40,000 or so a year, still be eligible. Or if you're a service related disabled veteran, or if you live in a unaccredited school district, or if you graduated from an unaccredited school, or what are the other? There's a couple of other criteria that we hoped would encourage greater diversity, inclusiveness, and equity in the industry. But we couldn't literally say there shall be X number of Black people that get a license. The courts just won't let us do that. I still think not arresting those folks is the best equity, the most important equity.
So can you explain the thing with the zip codes, that somehow they use the zip codes of the courthouses instead of the residences of the people?
I can't explain that. I literally don't understand. I've read also that there was something to do with courthouses. It doesn't make any sense at all. Supposedly, it is zip codes where more than that had an incarceration rate for marijuana 50% greater than the state average. And so somehow 65201 comes up when you do that. I didn't think Boone County was that much harsher than the average county. But the fact is that, you know, in recent years, at least, apparently there have not been that many people being incarcerated for marijuana, especially in the cities. And so, you know, DHSS has maintained that they're open to reconsidering that. They're open to receiving additional data. But keep in mind, those zip codes are not the only criteria. There are several other criteria that allow people to qualify. You know, if you qualify, if you meet any one of those criteria, then you're in the lottery. And, you know, one thing that no one knows, although there's a great deal of concern and justifiably about equity and inclusion in the industry, but no one really knows how many people of color applied for marijuana licenses. There's not a checkbox on the form. And so even the people that complain the loudest about that, they really don't know how many people of color applied for licenses. Now, DHSS is now, you can read the headline here, but they've recently said that they're going to do a survey, a demographic survey, to try to get a better grasp on how many people in the industry are people of color. I mean, right now, no one really even knows that for sure. I recently had a debate with somebody online about whether Asian Indians are people of color, because there is, you know, the dispensaries, Shangri-La dispensaries here in town and in Jeff City are owned by Asian Indian folks. Some of my Black friends say they're not people of color. Well, I think they would disagree, but at any rate, it leads to some interesting discussions. Hey, here's another interesting headline I want to be sure to share with all of you. Who's most likely to smoke weed? Is it older NPR listeners? There's some data apparently here that indicates that is the case. And in fact, there's other data that shows that the greatest increase in marijuana use is certainly not among young people or teenagers. Their use is dropping. The greatest increase in use is among our demographic. I think I can look around the screen here and say our, but for the most part, people of mature years have been the greatest increase in use. And there are several theories for why that may be. One is that they're going back to using that they used when they were in college, and they stopped when they were working or had kids, and now the kids have gone away and they've gone back to their former habits. But it's also a great deal of that use by older people really is medical, that many people who suffer, of course, greater ailments and injuries as we age do find that cannabis is a very important part of treating those conditions. And you know, there are many studies that demonstrate that making medical marijuana available saves lives. The death from opioid overdose is significantly lower in the states where there is legal access to medical marijuana. So it really is a life-saving matter. I will be happy to take other questions. I see a physical hand up. Yes, Pam, yes.
Dan, what's happening on the federal level with descheduling marijuana?
Yeah, great question. Yes. President Biden was, I think, the only one of 20 Democratic contenders for the nomination who did not support legalization. And nonetheless, thank God he got the nomination and beat Trump. And he's been slowly coming around. I mean, all the other Democrat contenders, including our vice president, they were all for full legalization. But Biden has always been a drug war hawk and helped to pass some of the worst drug laws in the nation. And I think his own family's experience with drug addiction and other problems has certainly reinforced that. But to his credit, and I like Biden, but to his credit, he has number one, in a very highly publicized move several months back, issued presidential pardons to very small amount federal defendants. And these are mostly people that were smoking marijuana on a canoe trip on a federal scenic riverway. And so there are a bunch of them right here in Missouri. Are people who were in a national park and got caught with marijuana. And those people having their records, a pardon is not as good as an expungement, and that's a whole nother issue. But a pardon just adds a line to your record. It doesn't clean your record. Nonetheless, I want to give Joe credit. It's a step in the right direction. The more important measure that was announced at the same time was that he has appointed a group of federal bureaucrats to study or D scheduling. Now, whether it's an R or a D matters here. Rescheduling means moving marijuana down on the list of controlled substances. The federal government is mimicked by the state of Missouri in setting up, I believe it's 5 schedules. And number 5 is over-the-counter drugs, and number 4 is stuff you need a prescription for, but it's not hard to get, and so forth. And you get up to Schedule 1, these are drugs that have no recognized medical use and are thought to have a very high potential for abuse. So those include heroin, LSD, and marijuana. And obviously, marijuana should not be in Schedule 1. But our argument is marijuana should not be on the schedule. Alcohol is not on the schedule. Tobacco is not on the schedule. There's no reason marijuana should be on any schedule of drugs. So we're very hopeful that Biden's committee will come back with that recommendation. It's maybe not likely. It's more likely they'll recommend moving marijuana to a less restrictive schedule, which will supposedly help to make research easier. But, research is not that difficult right now, especially in legal states. I cringed when I heard Hillary Clinton shortly before her defeat say, well, we just don't know enough about marijuana yet. She didn't support legalization either. The fact is, we know more about marijuana than we do about almost any pharmaceutical. If you go to pubmed.gov/marijuana, you will find at least 35,000 published studies. If you look up how many studies we have on ibuprofen, it's a small fraction of that. We know more about marijuana than we do about most other drugs. It's not a lack of research that's keeping it illegal. Hey, ARP, I like that. Oh, well,
This
see,
is
my time's
something
almost up.
that the president can make an executive decision on?
I think so. It's not clear. The lines are not clearly drawn on what the chief executive can do. He thought he could clear up everybody's college student loan debt.
Yeah.
The court said, no, he can't do that. So he's found some other way. He thinks he can do it now. But I think the president could order rescheduling. He could order the executive branch agencies, the DEA, the FDA, and perhaps other related entities to reschedule if he chose to do so. The next Democrat president is almost certainly going to be a legalizer. And so,
Yeah, I would think so.
that
After that is done, then the banking issue
Yeah.
Federally will be then they can take care of that.
Maybe that's moving through Congress, and I'm sure Biden would sign that if it came to his desk.
Okay.
There's growing bipartisan support for banking reform. I was going to say the reason that I was down in Raleigh 2 days ago in front of a judge there arguing that my client, clearly a legitimate medical user, should be allowed to use marijuana as medicine while on probation. And of course, I pointed out the Missouri Constitution says so. He says, well, Mr. Beat, what about the supremacy clause? Article 6 of the US Constitution says, and he rattles it off. He's clearly just been, looking this up, and the prosecutors had prompted him, I think. And I regret I wasn't as well prepared as I should have been for that argument, but the argument ain't over. The case is not yet resolved. On my way home, I thought, well, that's not a conflict. Yes, federal law says that marijuana is illegal, but that doesn't create a direct conflict. If federal law said thou shalt revoke probation for marijuana use, and the Missouri Constitution says you shall not revoke probation for marijuana use, that would be a direct conflict. But I don't think we really have a conflict. It's not the case that federal and state law have to be exactly the same. I mean, there'd be no need for state government if that was true. So this is the argument, the debate that's going on, the back and forth, and the fact that it's still against federal law. It reminds me of Ralphie in A Christmas Story, where every time he said, I want my Red Ryder BB gun, everyone says, you'll shoot your eye out, kid. And it's like every time I say, the Constitution of Missouri says marijuana is legal, judge, and I'll say, yeah, but it's still against federal law. And so getting it not against federal law would really help a lot of people. And so I hope we'll see that soon. Sarah says KOPN can't take underwriting money from dispensaries because they're regulated by the FCC. I wonder where that ruling came from. I'd like to see the source for that.
And somebody's going to test that someday, but it's not going to be our little bitty station.
Well,
we're not lawyered up enough to be the test case for that. We don't want to be the test case for that. But somebody's going to push that line eventually.
If the FCC says so, that'd be one thing, but
it's all like case law and conjecture. The FCC is real mysterious. The way you're going to get in trouble is somebody else got in trouble, and so you might get in trouble too. Like it's after the fact, so
That's
you're already in
true.
trouble by the time you realize you shouldn't have done something.
Yes, that's often. Well, Sarah, I would never have thought you'd be even approaching 50. That's a shock.
Oh.
That's a
Yeah, kids keep me young.
pro bono opportunity, no doubt about it.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation, and really interesting hearing your perspective, Dan.
Thank you.
Anyone?
It's 1 o'clock. Shall we
So
wrap
I'm
up?
just looking to see
Mhm.
last chance. Yeah, I am. I was born the same year as KOPN. It's easy to remember. And I often, when I'm selling underwriting, people ask about our listeners. I'm like, well, we were founded by a bunch of pot smoking hippies in 1973, and they like that's pretty much our demographic, kind of that old generation.
That's a demographic.
I have one more question of Dan. Your August meeting of the Civil Liberties Association.
Yeah,
Is there anything special on the agenda?
well, there will be. Yes, absolutely. I can't tell you right now what it is, but yes, really, seriously, we are very open to participation from anybody, anytime. We have a group called MOCLA, the Mid-Missouri Civil Liberties Association. For 42 years, we had an ACLU chapter here in Columbia and Mid-Missouri. And then the ACLU, and not just here, but nationally, decided to do away with local chapters. So we said, well, we're going to associate our own civil liberties group. And so we've continued to function for the past several years as an independent group. But we cooperate with the ACLU. And so we'd love to have participation. Anybody that's interested, just drop me an email, danbeats@gmail.com, or call my office if you wish, and let me know that you want the Zoom link, and we'll be glad to send it to you. We meet next on.
I have it on the announcement stand.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for
We've been
that.
announced for a couple weeks now.
Is it August 5, Pam? I think it's August 5.
It'll be in today's announcements. It is August
It's
something.
that first Saturday.
Alice, I see you waving your hand. Did you have
There's one question that Dan might have answered, but I missed.
Yeah.
Somebody asked if there's oversight on the Department of Revenue
Yeah.
in collecting the money if they're spending it correctly.
Well, and
Excuse
again, there is in the sense that all of that information is public. The press is supposed to be the watchdog for us. But the Veterans Commission, for instance, on the money that's supposed to go to the Veterans Commission, I'm pretty sure they keep an eye on that. Public Defender Commission, they want their money. They're going to keep an eye on that. So yes, I think there are some built-in safeguards. But I agree with you that needs to be watched. I do not trust the General Assembly in any regard. Yeah, here's a link to the MOCLA
Thanks, Dave.
Facebook page.
Hey, Dave
Yeah.
Taylor is good about keeping us on track with those kinds of things.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Mid MOCLA,
Yeah.
Mid Missouri Civil Liberties Association. We do have some interesting discussions and some interesting guests. We've had legislators visit us. We've had the ACLU staff join us. Yeah, no, I can't afford to retire, Carl. Those judges and prosecutors have those sweet pensions, but us defense lawyers,
Yeah.
work is our
Gotta self-funded.
retirement. Yeah, and I still enjoy it. Lucky for me, I still enjoy going to court and being a defense lawyer. So I better.
Thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.
Thank you again for taking the time to be here today.
My pleasure.
Last chance. Oh, Kathy, you have your hand up, love. I'm sorry, I almost missed it.
Clapping. I'm just clapping.
Oh, you're clap. I'm sorry. I thought it was, you're right. It was a
Thank
sideways.
you.
It was a clap.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Okay,
very
yeah,
much.
great. Okay, well, I think we'll go on to our business meeting. Dan, you're welcome to stay. You know how this goes, or you're welcome to